Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. So today we're going to be looking at something a little different, beginner English lessons.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and specifically, we're going to analyze how three different podcasts that are all aimed at brand new English learners use daily routines as like a teaching tool.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we have talking about daily routines. We have what do you do every morning, and English for Beginners, episode 1, introducing yourself.
Okay, cool.
So I think, people might be thinking daily routines, that sounds a bit basic, but trust me,
Right.
there's a method to the madness.
For sure.
So why don't we start with you kind of giving us an overview of why daily routines are such a good starting point for language learners?
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting is these podcasts tap into how our brains learn most effectively, right? So starting with daily routines isn't just about simplicity, it's about giving your brain the building blocks that it needs to make sense of a new language.
Okay, so can you break that down a little bit more for me? Why are daily routines such a powerful starting point?
Yeah, well, think about it. Waking up, eating, going to work, these actions form the backbone of our lives.
Right.
And the vocabulary that we use to talk about these routines, it's what we call high frequency. And these words are like the workhorses of language. They come up constantly in everyday conversations.
So it's not just about being easy to understand, but it's more about giving learners a foundation of the most important words they'll need to actually use the language.
Precisely. And actually, research even suggests that mastering these high-frequency words early on primes the brain for language acquisition.
Wow, okay.
They act like anchors, so it's easier to learn and remember less frequent vocabulary later on. It's like building a house. You need a solid foundation before you can start adding the fancy details.
Right, that makes total sense. And I noticed that in the introducing yourself script, they spend a lot of time on something that seems really simple. Like they ask, what's your name? And they really encourage the listener to practice saying it out loud at home.
Yeah.
So interesting how something so simple can be so important.
Right. And I think it might seem basic, but it's a brilliant example of how these podcasts emphasize active participation, which is essential for learning a language, right? So you're not just passively listening, you're being prompted to use the language, even if it's just a single phrase. And this helps move the language from passive understanding to active use, which is huge.
It's like the difference between reading about how to ride a bike and actually getting on and pedaling.
Exactly. You can study all the theory you want, but until you actually use the language, it's not going to stick.
Right. And I noticed that all three of these podcasts use really simple sentence structures. And they repeat key phrases over and over again, like talking about daily routines. They use, I wake up at, and then they just change the time.
Yeah.
I was wondering about that. It seemed a bit repetitive, but now that you mention it, it makes me think of when I was learning guitar, my teacher had me practice the same chords over and over again, and I thought it was so tedious.
Yeah.
But it allowed me to eventually play more complex songs.
That's a great analogy. Repetition might feel tedious, but it's actually really effective for your brain. When you repeat a phrase or a structure, you're strengthening the pathways in your brain that are associated with that language.
So it's not even just about understanding the words. It's like training your brain to actually produce those words and sentences almost automatically.
Exactly. And this kind of repetition is really important for internalizing grammar rules. Instead of memorizing all these rules, learners are exposed to correct grammar in a natural way just through repeated exposure.
It's like learning grammar by osmosis.
Pretty much, and it's way more effective than traditional rote learning methods. But these podcasts, they don't just rely on repetition, they also use visual aids and real-world examples.
Yes.
Like in talking about daily routines, when they mention certain foods for breakfast like coffee and toast or tea and eggs.
Oh, yeah. I love that it's like they're helping learners actually create a picture in their mind of what they're learning.
Exactly. It's called multisensory learning, and it's all about engaging as many senses as possible to make learning more effective. So by adding those visual elements, these podcasts aren't just teaching vocabulary, they're helping learners build rich connections with those words.
It's like the difference between seeing a picture of a croissant and then actually smelling freshly baked croissants in a Parisian cafe.
Precisely, and that makes language learning less about memorizing these abstract concepts and more about making meaningful connections.
And I also noticed that all three of these podcasts have a really encouraging tone. Like, it's not about being perfect right away. It's more about celebrating the small victories and those moments when something finally clicks.
Yeah, that's so important. I think they understand that positive reinforcement is essential for staying motivated, and learning a language can be really daunting, and it's easy to get discouraged, especially when you're first starting out.
Right, and it's almost like they're saying, hey, you're doing great. Keep going. You got this.
Yes, and this positive feedback helps learners feel supported, especially if we think about our listener, the learner who doesn't like to feel overwhelmed.
All right.
These podcasts provide a gentle entry point into learning a language. They break it down into manageable steps.
It's like they're saying, hey, you don't have to climb Mount Everest today. Just focus on taking one step at a time.
Exactly. And that is such a powerful message for anyone who is starting to learn something new. It's about building your confidence one small victory at a time.
Okay, so we've talked about high-frequency vocabulary repetition, visual aids, and positive reinforcement. And these are all strategies that these podcasts are using. But I have a feeling that there's more to uncover here, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We've only just scratched the surface.
Okay.
These beginner lessons are doing way more than just teaching vocabulary and grammar. They're subtly introducing something much deeper cultural nuances.
Oh, now we're talking cultural nuances. Let's
Okay.
dive into that.
Okay, so for instance, those breakfast examples we were talking about earlier, Mark mentions coffee and toast, which is pretty typical in Western cultures, while Sarah talks about tea and eggs.
Yes, I noticed that too. It's such a small detail, but it's so interesting.
Right, and while it might seem insignificant, I think those subtle differences can really spur curiosity and encourage learners to explore those differences even further.
It's like planting a seed.
Exactly, and it goes beyond food, like in what do you do every morning?
Hmm.
They talk about packing a bag and the importance of being organized, and while these might seem like practical things, they can actually reflect cultural values.
Oh, interesting.
So like the emphasis on organization and preparation that could reflect a culture that values planning and punctuality,
Yeah.
which might be different from other cultures where spontaneity is more valued.
Wow, you're right. It's amazing how much can be packed into seemingly simple language.
Yeah, and that's what I think is so fascinating about these beginner lessons. They're not just teaching language in isolation, they're actually laying the groundwork for cultural understanding.
Right. It's like they're giving learners a window into different ways of life and encouraging them to kind of embrace the differences.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes language learning so cool. It's not just about getting a new skill, it's about like broadening your horizons and connecting with the world in a deeper way.
Absolutely. It's about seeing the world through different eyes, experiencing different ways of being,
Yeah.
and just recognizing the beauty in all those differences.
Exactly, and I think these beginner podcasts do such a good job of planting those seeds of curiosity and understanding.
It's almost like they've managed to fit so much into these simple lessons.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, I'm also struck by how much these podcasts emphasize that language learning is interactive. It's not just listening and repeating, it's about actually using the language to communicate.
Right. From the very beginning, they're encouraging learners to speak, to answer questions, and even try to make their own sentences.
Like in English for Beginners, when the host asks the listener to say their name out loud.
Exactly. It might seem small, but it's powerful because that direct engagement reinforces the idea that language is a tool for communication and not just something that you study. It's about connecting with people.
Yeah, it's like they're building a community from the very beginning. It's not just you in a textbook anymore.
Yeah.
So if our listener and the learner is like dipping their toes into language learning for the first time, what does this all mean?
I think it means that they're in good hands. These beginner podcasts, they're proof that language learning can be thoughtfully designed. They take these complex skills and break them down into smaller steps, and they use interesting techniques to make learning fun and effective.
It's like they're giving learners a blueprint for success.
Exactly, and it reminds us that everyone starts somewhere. The important thing is to enjoy the journey, celebrate the small wins, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how we learn and grow.
I love that. That's so inspiring. So we've seen how these podcasts use daily routines to teach not only language, but also cultural elements. They emphasize active learning and they encourage interaction. But is there anything else we should mention before we wrap up?
Yeah, there's one more really important thing that brings all of this together, and it's something that is at the heart of being human storytelling.
Ooh, storytelling. I knew we had to get to this.
So in each of these podcasts, they're not just presenting facts or grammar rules, they're putting those things into little stories using their own daily routines as examples.
Like when in talking about daily routines, they each describe what they do when they wake up. It's not just verbs. It's like a glimpse into their lives.
Exactly. And by giving information in a story, it's more interesting and easier to remember.
Which makes sense. I can remember the plot of a book I read years ago, but I don't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday.
Yeah, our brains love stories. We remember details and emotions more easily when they're in a story. It's like how we teach history. We don't just give lists of dates and battles. We tell stories about the people who lived through those events.
Right. It's like the difference between a textbook and a movie.
Exactly. And that's what these podcasts do with language learning. They're not just teaching words like wake up or eat breakfast. They're giving you a chance to experience a day in the life of another person.
It's like a window into another world.
Exactly. And these English podcasts, they're opening that window for new learners, and they're using those familiar routines to invite them into this world of new possibilities.
It's like so much more than just learning a language. It's about broadening your horizons and connecting with the world.
Right. And these beginner English podcasts do a great job of opening that window for new learners, using the familiar structure of daily routines to let them see all these new possibilities.
I love that it's so much more than just learning a new language. It's about expanding our world and connecting with more people.
Yeah.
It's about seeing that even in something as simple as a daily routine, there's a story waiting to be told.
Exactly. And that's what makes language learning so interesting. It's not just learning a new skill, it's about understanding ourselves and the world around us better.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for our listener, the learner who has been listening to all of this, what's the one thing we want them to remember about storytelling and language?
I'd say remember that language is more than just words and grammar. It's a way to connect with people and share experiences and understand the world. And stories are how we do all of that.
I love that. So for our listener, we encourage you to use the power of storytelling when you're learning a language. Don't just try to memorize vocabulary and grammar. Find stories, listen to podcasts, read books, watch movies, and let those stories bring the language to life.
And remember, every story you hear, every conversation you have, every new word you learn, it's all a step forward on your language learning journey.
It really is. It's all about taking those first steps and then letting yourself enjoy the journey one story at a time.
And that's what makes learning a language so fun. It never really ends. There's always something new to learn and something new to share.
Okay, so we've looked at how these podcasts are so good at teaching English. We've seen how they teach about culture, and we've talked about how powerful storytelling is. What a great deep dive this has been.
It really has. And I think it shows us that learning a new language is more than just learning a skill. It's about understanding people and connecting with them and seeing how many different ways there are to experience life.
That's a great way to put it. But before we let our listeners go, I have a feeling you have one last piece of advice for them.
I do, and it goes along with everything we've been talking about today. So remember how these podcasts start with daily routines, but they don't end there.
Okay.
They want learners to take what they've learned and use it to talk about other parts of their lives.
So it's like a stepping stone.
Yeah.
You learn the basics, and then you can do so much more.
Right. Once you can talk about your day, you can start using those same skills to talk about anything, your hobbies, your family, your dreams.
That's when it gets really fun.
Exactly. Language opens up so many doors. It lets us connect with people from other places and share ideas and express ourselves.
Sounds like a superpower.
I like that. And it's a superpower that anyone can have. You just have to practice and be patient and be open to the adventure.
Well said. So for our listener,
Yeah.
the learner, what's the main thing we want them to remember?
I think the main thing is this: learning a new language isn't just about memorizing words and grammar. It's about connecting with people and learning about different ways of seeing the world. And it all starts with taking that first step. So it's kind of like these podcasts are using daily routines as a starting point, but they're not stopping there. They're kind of encouraging learners to build on that, and use those skills to expand their vocabulary and grammar and use those to talk about other parts of their lives.
So like it's a stepping stone.
Yeah.
You master the basics, and then you can start to branch out and talk about more complex things.
Exactly. Like once you can talk about your daily routine, you can start using those same language skills to talk about other stuff like your hobbies, your family, or even your dreams.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. When you can start using the language to express yourself in ways that are more personal and meaningful.
For sure, language is so much more than just like basic communication. It's about connecting with other people, like on a deeper level, sharing your thoughts and feelings and experiencing the world through this new lens.
Right, like you're unlocking a whole new dimension of experience.
Exactly. And these podcasts, I think they do a really good job of, even in these early lessons, kind of hinting at those possibilities,
Yeah.
they're planting those seeds for like a lifetime of language exploration and cultural discovery.
And that's a journey that anyone can take. You don't need any special background or experience.
Exactly. It's never too late to start learning a new language. And I think what's so great about these podcasts is that they make that starting point really accessible and enjoyable.
And speaking of making things accessible, I'm really impressed by how these podcasts manage to introduce some pretty complex concepts in a way that's easy to understand. Like they touch on things like cultural relativity and the importance of understanding different perspectives.
That's a great point, and I think it really shows how much thought the creators of these podcasts put into them. They're not just teaching language. They're also subtly introducing learners to concepts that are so important for navigating a world that is so diverse and interconnected.
Like they're laying the groundwork for developing intercultural competence.
Exactly. And they're doing it in a way that feels really natural and organic, like weaving these ideas into everyday conversations. It's not like they're preaching or anything. It's just a subtle invitation to see the world from a different perspective.
Yeah, like they're saying, hey, there are all these different ways of being in the world, and they're all valid. Let's explore them together.
Right. And I think that's such an important message, especially for people who are just starting to learn new language and are stepping outside of their comfort zones. It's about encouraging them to be curious and open-minded, which is so important for learning a language.
It's about appreciating the beauty of diversity.
Mm.
Just because something's different doesn't mean it's wrong or bad.
Exactly. And that's a really valuable lesson that goes way beyond just learning a language. It's about developing empathy and understanding, which are so important for connecting with people from different cultures and creating a more peaceful and inclusive world.
That's beautifully said. It's amazing how learning a new language can open up so many possibilities for growth and exploration.
It really is. And it all starts with those first steps, those basic phrases and routines that are part of our everyday lives.
And these podcasts do such a great job of showing people how to take those first steps and making them feel less scary and more inviting.
Yeah, they're like friendly guides leading learners into a new world, with patience and encouragement. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about how these podcasts introduce cultural differences, promote understanding between cultures, and create a supportive learning environment. But before we move on, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the power of storytelling.
Oh, yes. Storytelling, it's such an important part of what makes us human. It's how we understand the world, connect with each other, and pass on knowledge and wisdom.
And these podcasts really use that power. Well, don't they? They're not just teaching words and grammar, they're telling stories.
Exactly, and that's what makes them so engaging and memorable. Think about how much easier it is to remember a story than a bunch of facts.
Oh, absolutely. I can remember stories from years ago, but I can hardly remember what I had for breakfast this morning.
Right, and it's not just about being entertained. Stories have this amazing ability to take us to different places, make us feel empathy for people who are different from us, and help us understand complex ideas in a way that feels natural and meaningful.
Like they help us see the world from someone else's perspective.
Yeah. Exactly, and these podcasts, they use that to their advantage. They're not just teaching learners how to say, I wake up at 7 o'clock. They're inviting them to imagine what it would be like to wake up at 7 o'clock in a different culture with different customs and traditions.
It's like they're creating a bridge between what's familiar and what's unfamiliar.
Exactly. And that's what makes language learning so powerful. It's not just about learning a skill. It's about expanding your understanding of yourself and the world.
So for our listener, the learner who's been listening to all of this, what's the key takeaway here? What do we want them to remember about storytelling and language learning?
I would say this: remember that language is more than just words and grammar. It's a way to connect with other people, share experiences, and understand the world, and stories are the tools that help us do all of those things.
Beautifully said. So we encourage you to embrace the power of storytelling in your own language learning journey. Don't just focus on memorizing words and grammar. Seek out stories, listen to podcasts, read books, watch movies, and immerse yourself in the narratives that make language come alive.
And remember, every story you encounter, every conversation you have, every new word you learn is a step forward on your language learning journey.
So true. It's all about taking those first steps and then letting the journey unfold naturally, one story at a time.
And that's what makes language learning so exciting. It's a journey that never truly ends. There's always something new to discover, new things to learn, and new things to share. It's really about remembering that learning a new language is about more than just memorizing words and grammar rules. It's about connecting with other people and seeing the world in new ways. And it all starts with just taking that first step.
That's a great point. And it can be as simple as describing what you do every morning. It's amazing how something so ordinary can actually be so profound. And I think what's really cool about these beginner English podcasts is that they take something as basic as a daily routine and they turn it into a way to discover a whole new world.
Right. And I think that's a good reminder for anyone who might feel a little intimidated by learning a new language. It doesn't have to be overwhelming. It can be as simple as starting with what you already know, like those routines that are part of your everyday life.
Exactly. It's about finding those things, you're comfortable with those things that give you the confidence to take those first steps. And once you have those basics down, the possibilities are endless.
You can start branching out and exploring new topics, and you can
Yeah.
start using the language to express yourself in more creative and meaningful ways.
So for our listener, the learner who's been with us on this deep dive into the world of beginner English lessons, what's the final message we want to leave them with?
I think it's this embrace the journey, learning a new language. It's a process and it's not always going to be easy. There will be times when you get frustrated or you might start to doubt yourself, but there will also be those amazing moments of joy and connection and discovery that make it all worth it.
I couldn't agree more. And remember, there are so many resources out there to help you on your journey, like podcasts and apps and online courses, and even language exchange partners. Find what works best for you. Stay curious, and most importantly, have fun.
Exactly. Learning a language should be a fun experience. So go out there, explore, experiment, and enjoy the ride.
And that's a wrap for this deep dive into the world of beginner English lessons and the power of daily routines. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.